Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for coming out for the third and final element of the project that we had for this term that focuses on resistance and rebellion at sea, that looks at the element of resistance that came from enslaved people from the very moment that they fell under the clutches of European enslavers. We were very interested in doing this kind of project, and I'm very happy that our speaker tonight was one of the persons that I would call my co-conspirator, that we thought of this project together. She will never admit it. She's, as you know, she's very unassuming about these kind of things, but we very early on not only imagined this project, but also imagined the individuals. We imagined who we would want to invite, and then invited those individuals. And fortunately, they were people that she was familiar with, and once I put her name out there, they were all very happy to come. We are really pleased with the success of the project thus far. I think that we were able to bring in folks who looked at several sides of it. Our first guest, Marcus Rediker, as you know, is a giant in this field, is very much a pioneer at looking at the social phenomenon of the slave ship, not only on in its effects on those individuals that were enslaved, but also on the enslavers. A very, very comprehensive look at the way that slavery dehumanizes and in many ways diminishes everything that it touches. Our second speaker, for those of you who are here, I know you enjoyed her as well, was Shawande Mustaqim, who did a very, very interesting study of the ways that our work on slavery oftentimes does not account for women, children, and the elderly, those individuals who tend not to show up in the record, with her contention being that in many cases, because of the focus on men, you don't hear very much about what happened to women. So having her discuss that element of gender, as well as children and the elderly, was important to what we're trying to do. Today and this evening, however, we have a very special treat because we have someone right here at the university who's been doing this work, who's been doing it in ways that have been both very visible to us, but sometimes behind the scenes. As I said, she has been here every step of the way and has helped to guide us in determining what would go into the exhibition and determining the ways that we would sort of structure the presentation to you. I'm going to leave the introduction of Professor Lindsay to Selena Bray, who's here with us. You don't have to sit down. I'm not going to be too much longer. But in terms of welcome, I want to thank you once again for taking the time to come. Hopefully you get an opportunity to walk through the exhibition. The staff of the Stone Center did a wonderful job of installing it and making sure that the feeling that you get when you walk through the space very much reflects what we feel are the important elements of this particular phenomenon. As I mentioned, this is the last in the series, so if it's possible, if you are so moved, please invite your colleagues to come through. Once again, I am welcoming you to the Stone Center. Unfortunately, our director had to take care of some family business this evening and is not able to make it, so I'm simply standing in. But thank you again for coming. And Selena, if you will come up and do the formal introductions for us.
Lisa Lindsay is professor and chair of the Department of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. A specialist in the history of southwestern Nigeria, the slave trade, and the Atlantic world, she is the author of Atlantic Bonds, a 19th century odyssey from America to Africa, which won the African Studies Association's prize for the best book in any field of African studies, published in 2017. Her previous publications include Working with Gender, Wage Labor and Social Change in Colonial Southwestern Nigeria, Captives as Commodities, the Transatlantic Slave Trade, and the co-edited volumes Men and Masculinities in Modern Africa and Biography and the Black Atlantic. She has won fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Humanities Center, and the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and her outstanding teaching has been recognized with a UNC Distinguished Term Professorship. And we just want to thank Professor Lindsay for her continued collaboration and cooperation, and state that we are really excited to hear her ruminations this evening. So thank you, Professor Lindsay.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for these wonderful introductions. I had such a nice time sitting there listening to it. I kind of didn't want those to end, but I suppose now I need to sing for my supper. Thank you all for being here. It's really great to see so many colleagues, historians. It's like my overlapping Venn diagrams. I see historians and Africanists and former students and current students and grad students. And so it's really wonderful to have you all here. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you, Selena, for that very generous introduction and for helping to organize this, and for Joseph Jordan, who downplayed his own contributions as leader of the Stone Center for many, many years, up until he recently has been released onto other things, but continues to organize and bring people together and generally facilitate. So thank you all. As many of you know, I'm teaching a research seminar this semester on the Atlantic slave trade. So this talk not only allows me to trot out some ideas for a project that's kind of in the early stages, but also to demonstrate to my students that I too can try to undertake a research project. So the subject of my talk this evening is a remarkable slaving voyage. And in an English ship headed from the Bight of Benin port of Ouida to Jamaica in June of 1770. I actually mapped it out on Google Maps. Let's see, there we go. If you fly this route now, it takes almost 23 hours. Although the voyage I'm going to talk about is much longer than that. And this voyage was unusual because compared to other slave ships, it included a very high proportion of female captives. Women outnumbered men as prisoners in its hold, although typically in the Atlantic slave trade, African women made up no more than about a third of captives. And the voyage was also unusual for another reason. Its enslaved prisoners rose in revolt not once, not just in sight of land, but at multiple occasions throughout the nearly 7 weeks that the ship crossed the Atlantic Ocean. According to the captain's ship log, I don't know if y'all can read this, but I'll give you the highlights. On June 4th, 1770, he, quote, put 40 men in irons for making an insurrection. 2 days later, the slaves made an insurrection which was soon quelled with the loss of 2 women slaves. On the 22nd of June, Norris recorded that the slaves attempted another insurrection after the death of a girl slave, number 13, lost a man who jumped overboard and was drowned. Employed securing the men in chains and gave the women concerned 24 lashes each. 4 days later, on June 26, we learned that a few of the slaves got off their handcuffs but were detected in time. The next day, quote, the slaves attempted to force up the gratings in the night with the design to murder the whites or drown themselves, but were prevented by the watch in the morning. Oh, by the way, the other thing that the Captain Robert Norris wrote in his logbook every day was longitude and latitude marks for where the ship was. So I could plug those into Google Maps and get that's what's prompted these maps, or the little snippets of map on my timeline. So I can see where the ship was at each of these junctures where the captain was making these recordings. And so what we have here is men and women on multiple occasions attempting to free themselves. The rebels suffered violent retributions, but they nearly succeeded. Perhaps fittingly, the name of the ship where this coordinated resistance took place was the Unity. So my talk this evening anchors a history of women aboard the Unity to a broader analysis of gender dynamics in the Atlantic slave trade. It's based on preliminary research for what I hope will be a book. I have the luxury of some leave coming up next year, and I'm hoping to work on this full time. And what I envision is that a contextualized examination of the revolts on the Unity will help readers to understand the experiences and impact of women in this slave trade, from Atlantic Africa through the Middle Passage. How did Atlantic slaving transform women's lives in African societies? How did captives, female and male, confront and endure the Middle Passage? How did women shape insurrections? And in the spirit of Marcus Rediker, who got this series started, I'll end with what I hope is some larger inspiration that we can take from this microhistory. First, you might be interested in how I came to this project and why you should hear about the slave trade and African history from me. I first started studying African history as an undergrad many years ago, and then did a bunch of stints of research in Nigeria, and so I am going to be a little shameless and show you an old picture here. But most of my research has been in Southwest Nigeria. Obviously, I'm not African, but this is entangled history, produced in the interactions between Africans and Europeans, with reverberations through time that have shaped the world that we have all inherited. And I think it's up to the descendants of Europeans, as well as the descendants of Africans, to remember that history and to try to undo some of its damages. In fact, I think it's intellectually lazy and morally suspect for descendants of Europeans to leave all of this work to descendants of Africans as one more burden to place upon them. This is a bit of in keeping with the principle of you broke it, you pay for it. Okay, back to the Unity. There goes my picture. You did not just take a picture of my picture. All right, never. All right, here we go. The ship log for this voyage is hiding in plain sight. It's digitized and online, posted at the website of the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. There's also a lot of information available about the captain, Robert Norris, who published a memoir of trading with the Kingdom of Dahomey, and in the 1790s gave parliamentary testimony in favor of continuing the slave trade. We know less about the African side of the story, but the port of Ouida did have 3 European ports. There's one, European forts, that is, all of which left records. About the prisoners being held captive in the hold of the Unity, though, we have to exercise all of our powers of historical imagination and empathy. Okay, who were the captives? According to the captain's records, nearly all of the prisoners aboard the Unity embarked from the coast of present-day Republic of Benin. So here's a map to orient you. Here's the Republic of Benin. Here's a zoom in of the southern part there. Between December 1769 and April 1770, the Unity lay at anchor off the shore of the port of Ouida, where Norris and his sailors loaded some 200 prisoners onto the ship. Later on, when the Unity docked for provisioning at the island of Sao Tome, it took in another 200 prisoners transferred from a different ship. This second group of prisoners seems to have been loaded on board at Porto Novo, which is less than 40 miles east of Ouida. Historians' treatments of slaving from these 2 ports, Ouida and Porto Novo, offer some initial clues about the captives, particularly women and their weapons of resistance. So do you see them on this map? Here's Ouida right there, spelled in this instance with an O. Sometimes it's spelled with a W. And here's Porto Novo. They're only 40 miles apart on the coast. Okay, first the 200 captives loaded at Ouida. European ships had been docking at Ouida since the Portuguese established regular trade there in the 16th century. By the end of the 17th century, Dutch, English, and French traders also brought imported goods in exchange for gold, small quantities of ivory and palm oil, and thousands of enslaved people who were trafficked here from many sources. This lucrative trade attracted the attention of the rulers of Dahomey. Here we go. Dahomey, which was a powerful inland kingdom, and it sent an army to take control of the port of Ouida in 1727. Dahomey had the best trained and best equipped army in the region. Soldiers, like the ones pictured up there, carried flintlock muskets as well as steel swords for close fighting, all imported from Europe, and locally made shields. In the 1720s, Dahomey's King Agaja also acquired 25 cannons, although gunpowder had to be imported. It and all other imports were paid for through a royal monopoly on the spoils of war. Although soldiers received bonuses for each enemy killed or captured in battle, all prisoners taken by the army belonged to the king. And captives were used in a variety of ways, as workers on the king's farms or servants in the royal palaces, as patronage to army officers and royal officials, as religious sacrifices, and as payments to European traders at Ouida. Many of those trafficked people were war captives from a number of origins. Here, I'm going to change the picture. Here's Ouida. Ouida has now put up this commemorative sort of arch right at the coast, but I'm keeping the map up there so you can be oriented here. So many of those who were trafficked there were war captives. Close to Ouida, there were periodic hostilities between the original inhabitants and the Dahomeyan invaders. But Dahomey's armies also carried away captives from its excursions to the north of the capital at Abomey, although by the time of the Unity, there were a few such campaigns. In fact, fewer European trading ships were calling at the port of Ouida by that time than had done so before. In an effort to revive the trade, the king, Tegbesu is his name, wrote to the governors of the English and French forts, offering to make sure that the supplies of captives were provided. But without notable successes on the part of his military, he was forced to turn inward. Though Dahomey's own people were supposed to be protected from enslavement, this system seems to have broken down. Tegbesu may have, in fact, even provided Robert Norris with captives that his forces raised from within the palace itself. And I'll say more about that in a few minutes. Okay, that's Ouida. And it was the most heavily trafficked of all the slaving ports along the Bight of Benin. But it was not the only one. The 200 enslaved people transferred to the Unity from another ship at Sao Tome had likely been loaded on board at Porto Novo, where that other ship had spent several months in early 1770. Porto Novo was just down the coast from Ouida, but it was not under the King of Dahomey's control. European ships called there, as well as at other nearby ports, to purchase captives that were provided by the Kingdom of Oyo. Where's my map? Okay, here's Oyo, up here. Just to the, northeast of Dahomey in present-day southwest Nigeria. And these likely came from Oyo's own military excursions. But Oyo and Dahomey were both sending their militaries to the same hinterland area between the two kingdoms. And so they were both drawing on the same territory for their supplies of captives. And it's likely that some of those people were women who were taken prisoner. Decades later, a survivor of one of those campaigns, Muhammad Bakwakwa, described his own capture. And he says, "When the wars came on suddenly, the women and children have no means of escape, but are taken prisoners and sold into slavery." And in fact, 92 of the 200 captives who were loaded onto the Unity from that second ship were female. We know from the captain's log that the Unity left the port of Ouida on April 28, 1770, with initially 227 captives on board. It then sailed to the island of Sao Tome, like I said before, where at the end of May it took on fresh water, food, and 200 more captives from that second ship. So now there were a total of 425 people imprisoned on the ship, more than half of them women. By the beginning of June, the ship's middle passage was underway, and so were the onboard insurrections. The sources written by Europeans don't tell us much about how the enslaved coped with and resisted their horrid conditions. And I want to pause and acknowledge the immense suffering endured by these and all captives on slave ships. This is a depiction from a French ship of the same year, 1770, and I don't know how well you can see from where you are, but a number of these imprisoned people are clearly women. There's more than one that's actually holding a baby in this picture. And so I don't want to minimize their suffering, but I also want to focus on their response. And we have some clues about that in the timing. And the timing of the uprising suggests that the captives were supported by a supernatural ally. All right, I'm going to change pictures here. Vodun, known as voodoo in Haiti, is a religious practice with origins in the modern-day Republic of Benin, a fact that is celebrated there, as you can see on this postage stamp from 1969. One of the most important deities of the Vodun pantheon is Sakpata, which is up there, the Vodun of smallpox, which devastated Dahomey and nearby areas repeatedly in the 18th century. Like most West Africans, the people of the Baida Benin region believed that the world was inhabited by seen and unseen forces, including spirits of departed ancestors and deities connected to nature and geography. Dahomey's monarchy was closely connected to one set of gods, which was patronized as kind of a state religion. But there was another set of deities considered as a rival to the king, and that set of deities was led by the earth god Sakpata. Sakpata was a force of political opposition in two ways. First, there was the god's epidemiological power. Smallpox was interpreted as the weapon of Sakpata, particularly when it afflicted Dahomey's kings, as it did several times in the 1700s. The Sakpata priests were the only people capable of intervening, and they treated individuals afflicted with smallpox by prescribing offerings to the Vodun and medicines for the sick, and they handled the bodies of those who died from it. And this led to the second way that Sakpata was related to political opposition. Its priests had influence and followers outside of the control of the monarchy. Priests charged money for their services and also inherited from those who died of smallpox, making them economic as well as political rivals to the king. Over the 18th century, Sakpata priests gained enormous political power as people were attracted to their healing skills. And in response, kings tried very hard to control the Vodun, establishing a minister of Vodun and a secret police to monitor the priests. On occasions when the Sakpata god was accused of supporting plots against the monarchy, many of its priests and followers were rounded up and sold into slavery. So viewed through the lens of West African cosmology, the slave dealer Robert Norris was in trouble very soon after he landed at Ouida in December 1770, when a smallpox epidemic was raging in West Africa. As Norris later wrote in his memoir, and now I'm sure y'all can't see this, can you? I'm just going to read it. In the year 1770, I had above 300 slaves on board a ship in Ouida Road when the smallpox appeared among them. The greater part of these were inoculated before a harmattan came on. Harmattan is the yearly winds that sweep down from the Sahara. And about 70 of them underwent that operation a few days after it set in. The former got along very well through the disorder. None of the latter had either any sickness or eruption. We thought we had got clear of the disorder, but in a very few weeks it began to appear among those 70. About 50 of them were inoculated the second time. The others had it in the natural way. A harmattan came on and they all recovered except one girl who had a malignant ulcer on the inoculated spot and died sometime afterward of a lockjaw. In local views, Sakpata sent smallpox as a sign of divine displeasure. So here it seems to be in opposition to Norris's slaving operation. But Norris and his surgeon fought back with inoculation, transferring small bits of pus from the lesions of those infected to others in hopes of bringing on a mild infection and then immunity from smallpox. This was both a European and an African technique, and it's not clear from Norris's logbook who actually performed the operations on the captives. In Dahomey, Sakpata priests inoculated themselves as a form of empowerment in order to embody the Vodun Sakpata. But when Norris or his agents inoculated captives against smallpox, Sakpata unleashed another weapon in his arsenal, which was lightning. On February 10th, 1770, fire in the British fort at Ouida consumed the roof of 3 rooms. Oh, here's a picture. There we go. The British fort at Ouida consumed the roof of 3 rooms, including the surgeon's room, and destroyed all his medicines. Take that. Acting through his representative in Ouida, the Dahomey king ordered his people to help with repairs on the British fort, but also summoned Norris to the capital, Abomey, to account for what had happened. Norris's logbook goes silent for the 3 months that he was there. But when he returned to Ouida in April 1770, he brought with him an additional 140 captives. I surmise that many of them were women previously under the king's control, and some likely to have had military background. Okay, why do I think this? Well, for one thing, 2 years later, Robert Norris was back, and he did purchase female slaves from the king of Dahomey. He wrote about this. He said they were women the king's blamed for starting a fire in his palace. So here we go, fire again. But more generally, I think many of the female captives on the Unity came from the Dahomey court because of the ways that the slave trade affected women, broadly as well as in the area under Dahomey's control. Atlantic slaving concentrated wealth in the hands of African rulers and merchants who amassed ever larger followings of their own slaves, clients, and household members, including wives. Here, I'll change pictures. Whoops, sorry, I'm behind my slides. There's the royal palace, there's Dahomey, there's the palace at Abomey. There we go. There's the king dispensing largesse in an annual ceremony. In the kingdom of Dahomey, by the mid-18th century, political leaders became fabulously wealthy, with hundreds or even thousands of slaves and wives. Norris wrote, here's Norris again, the common men in general had from 40 to 50 wives each, and their superiors from 300 to 400, and some of them even 1,000. The king himself maintained a harem of between 4,000 and 5,000. Most of these women were employed in tilling the ground for their respective husbands, such among them as could boast preeminent beauty, which elevated them to the rank of favorites, remained at home, yet were not entirely excused from servile duties, but waited upon their husbands. Besides agriculture, they were also occupied in spinning cotton, weaving cloths, and brewing a kind of beer, in dressing victuals for sale, and in carrying merchandise to the market. The king's palace housed perhaps thousands of these so-called wives of the leopard being the king. As Norris had pointed out, they did many types of work, from the most menial to administrative. The most senior woman, known in English as the Queen Mother, was not the king's mother per se, but the senior female official who oversaw a range of female economic activities and subordinate office holders. They and all women in the palace occupied separate quarters from the men and were guarded aggressively. Wives of the king might be visited by him little or not at all, but they could not marry or have sexual relations with anyone else. And as the slave trade developed, it offered new punishments for disobedience, sale abroad. But women did disobey, including by forming relationships of their own choosing. When discovered, these relationships were punished by execution, fines, or sale to Europeans at the coast. And we have examples of this from European slave trader testimony. Here's one from a slave trader doing business at Ouida in the 1720s. He says, one day a messenger from the king of Dahomey brought him 2 female slaves, saying that the king wanted him to buy them. Though he purchased one, he refused to buy the other, who he estimated to be 50 years old, and past her labor, as he says. Soon after, the intermediary reported that since the older woman had not been sold, the king had ordered her to be tied up, put in a canoe, rowed out to sea, and thrown overboard to be eaten by sharks. She had offended the king, the messenger said, because she had assisted some of the king's wives in their love affairs with other men. In fact, by the 18th century, when the slave trade had been raging for a century, it is likely that sale to Europeans was a way that men attempted to control and discipline what they perceived to be unruly women. Opportunistic Europeans described these acts not as resistance, but as adultery, helping to construct sexualized stereotypes of African women. One way that the king of Dahomey could have quickly gathered 200 captives for Robert Norris would have been to round up the most vulnerable in the capital, including out-of-favor wives. So I also said I thought that they probably had military background. Well, some of the women of the palace were people that Europeans called Amazons, the real-life female military guard of the king, as in the film The Woman King, numbering some 800 or so by the mid-18th century. But sometimes these people, too, were sold. The trader Richard Drake recorded in 1839 that he witnessed hundreds of slaves being sold by agents of the King of Dahomey to European purchasers at Ouida. At least 100, he said, were women of the king's guard who had engaged in revolt and were being punished by being sold off. They were fine-limbed, robust females, he wrote, made healthy by their exercise in military service. Okay, so let's get back to the unity. Where are we? We've got female captives, probably from the palace, perhaps with military background, likely who knew each other, and the god Sakpata showing displeasure with slaving and the activities of the king by bringing smallpox and fire. So that is, the captives have grievances, organization, and a supernatural ally. The Unity sailed from Ouida with its initial 227 captives at the end of April 1770, at the start of the rainy season. I don't know how much time y'all have been in West Africa in the month of April. Let me just say, rainy season doesn't mean it's raining torrentially all the time, but it means it rains a lot. Maybe it rains every day. But at the start of the rainy season, it can be very dramatic with thunderstorms and lightning, and thunder and lightning were interpreted as the rumblings of Sakpata. On the Unity, captives sought the favor of these unseen forces. The ship captain recorded in his log, totally oblivious, that the women, quote, played with colorful beads, ignorant of the fact that colorful beads, in fact, had significance as objects for communicating with Sakpata. And here's some beads, by the way, that someone has found in a file in the British National Archives from an 18th century slave trader, early 19th century slave trader. Another clue that the captives were seeking divine favor or divine help with their rebelliousness. The insurrections on the Unity nearly all took place at the beginning of a Dahomeyan 4-day week, a day considered sacred to Sakpata, and often they also coincided with illness outbreaks on board. Now, we know about this voyage because of the miracle of the preservation of its captain's log. But there's reason to think that its high proportion of female captives and its experience of rebellion was not so unusual for this time and place. As both contemporary and modern observers noted, slavery entailed a perpetual war between enslavers and their captives, who always resisted however they could. But let me show you some numbers here. Over the entire slave trade, the historian David Richardson has estimated that at least 10% of slaving ships experienced insurrections or attempted insurrections. But something even more dramatic appears to have been going on in the Bight of Benin around the time that the Unity sailed from there. 4 of the 26 slave ships leaving Bight of Benin ports between 1769 and 1772 recorded attempted insurrections. That is, more than 15%. This exceeded by far the average rate of resistance of the entire transatlantic slave trade, which is 10%, as well as the overall average rate of resistance in these years, which is 7.2%, and the rate of resistance from Bight of Benin ports in the entire 18th century, which is 5.7%. Don't let me muddle you with all these numbers. The point is there's something unusual going on in this time and place. Less than a year after the arrival of the Unity, another ship, the True Blue, came into Jamaica from the Bight of Benin, also with a female majority of captives, and also after war at sea. As Jamaica planter Simon Taylor described it in May 1771, quote, "There is a Guinea man came in, but as the slaves rose on the coast of Guinea and murdered the captain, and many were thrown overboard and drowned, I did not think it was prudent to buy any for you out of her, as they might be troublesome." European slavers believed women to be less prone to insurrection than men, but ships that experienced revolts had above average proportions of women captives. In fact, the Unity's seemingly anomalous concentration of women and their sustained resistance appears to be part of a pattern. The Unity was the lone British ship calling at Ouida between 1769 and 1771. But there were 9 French-sponsored voyages headed to Haiti. And among those 9, there were attempted insurrections on 2 of them, both with female majority captives. The courageous captives on the Unity then may thus form part of a larger cohort of Bight of Benin women affected by slaving and fighting against it. So how do I interpret this? The slave trade transformed the world. And one of the ways that it did so in West Africa was that it weighed heavily on women. Scholars have described the experiences of enslaved women in the Americas, but we've only begun to understand the Atlantic slave trade's profoundly gendered effects on African societies. And this should serve as a reminder, sorry, I'm just gonna get a little pedantic here for a second, but this should remind us that in Africa, as anywhere else, inequality meant that people experienced historical phenomena in different ways. And so it kind of gives the lie to this cliche that Africans, quote, sold their own people. We can't assume that any of this was their own people, one side, that we can't lump all these people together as their own people. The slave trade had its winners and losers, its supporters and dissidents, just like phenomena of similar magnitude all over the world. And so we can imagine something like a wave building gradually over time as elites grown wealthy on the slave trade intensified their exploitation of others, especially women. At the crest of the wave, a generation of women who had grown up in this environment, who chafed at the restrictions on land and were cast out into the sea, marshaled their visible and invisible weapons to fight back in larger numbers than ever before. Truly a West African age of revolution. And this gets us to the larger lessons to take from this deep dive into one slaving voyage. All right, there's our endpoint, Jamaica. The Unity limped into the waters off of Kingston, Jamaica on July 24th with 186 male and 221 female captives on board. The ship needed such extensive repairs that it was nearly a year before it could make the Atlantic crossing back to England. Meanwhile, the crew became sickly and rebellious. In December, Norris wrote that he put Mr. Thomas in irons and sent John Doran to be confined ashore. In January, he reported, "Several of my people sick with fatigue." But despite the damage to the ship and the morale of its crew, the captain and owners considered the voyage a success. The enslaved captives were likely sold in Jamaica, or at least some could have been transshipped to Charleston or maybe Virginia. We can hope that some part of the group that continued to rebel, we can hope that they were some part of the groups that continued to rebel or to escape to Spanish-controlled Cuba, but they may well have lived out their lives if they lived in abject slavery. So what do we learn from this one slaving voyage? First, the world we live in today was in large measure shaped by the Atlantic slave trade, which peopled the Americas, fueled massive economic and physical growth, distorted African societies, and created an ideological system that continues to undergird inequality of many kinds. If we want to understand today, we need to recognize this history. But secondly, we need to know about resistance. The resistance of the Union's captives and resistance to slaving more broadly was dangerous and rarely successful, but it changed history. The fear of insurrection caused slavers to take precautions which drove up the costs of their operations and thus reduced their scale, likely, according to one historian, saving an estimated 1 million additional Africans from forced export to the Americas. To reconstruct the resistance of African women, like those on the Unity, is to extend to them credit for this heroism. They, of course, could take no comfort in this. The brave captives aboard the Unity and all of the other slaving ships could not have known that the system would come to an end through the collective efforts of people like themselves, but it would take a century. Over time, though, one of the most momentous changes in the history of the world occurred. A phenomenon taken to be natural turned into something not just unfortunate, but illegitimate, morally wrong, and vulnerable to legal sanction. It happened through the collective efforts of a wide range of people over 4 continents: lawmakers, ethical consumers, religious reformers, people considered zealots and hellraisers, and crucially, enslaved women and men who risked everything. For my last slide, I put up a picture of perhaps the most famous person from the Republic of Benin alive right now, and that is the rock star Angelique Kidjo. And she's up there to frame my last thoughts on this, which is that nearly 250 years later, we continue to live in the world that the slave trade made, with its deep inequalities, some of them chiseled by racism, along with new challenges layered on top. Perhaps our view of poverty or even climate change is like the 18th century view of slavery. It's unfortunate, but we're stuck with it. And this is where the people of the Unity can inspire resistance against forces of oppression that may even seem insurmountable today. So, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to any questions you might have. Chris.
Hi, Dr. Lindsay.
Hi, Chris.
How's it going? So I just wanted to ask briefly, you mentioned that the Unity in Sao Tome had picked up 200 additional captives from another ship. What was the nature of that transaction? Was it a captain purchasing the captives from perhaps an associate or a friend? Was it a matter of the captain approaching Norris and saying that due to unforeseen circumstances, he was not going to be able to transport his human cargo? And whatever circumstance it was it something that can be seen as a common trend throughout the trade?
Good question, and I think it might be informed by your research on slave ship sailors. I didn't want to get into the weeds of all of this, but the second ship was owned by the same conglomerate of owners as owned the Unity. The Unity was owned by a business partnership of 6 owners, businessmen from Liverpool. And that those 6 owners also owned another ship called the Society. And they had hired the captains of both ships, Norris and the captain on the Society, and they gave them written instructions. We've talked in class before about written instructions that slave ship captains sometimes got from the ship owners. And the written instructions to the Society said, rendezvous with the Unity in Sao Tome and give them your captives. I'm not sure why, but they ended up sending the Society then back to Africa to make more purchases. So maybe it was just a matter of shipping efficiency from their point of view, but it was all part of the owner's grand design here. But thank you for that question. Vicki.
Thank you very much for that question. So it seems like for information about rebellions on ships, you're very dependent on the captain's logs, this captain and other captains. Would Could there have been any motivation for captains not to report the existence of rebellions on their ships? I'm wondering something to do with perhaps insurance on ships, or the value of the slaves, or the enslaved people, as you noted, might be less desirable to the purchasers had they been involved in rebellions. So can you really I'm sure that those percentages that you cited aren't absolute, but could there be many more rebellions that captains wouldn't report?
Probably, yeah. And I think you're right that they sometimes had motivations to downplay the rebelliousness, or sometimes they didn't know, you know. But there were other times where they really wanted to play it up because they wanted to show the ship owners how heroic they had been. So, oh, look at me, I had to quell these rebellions. I had these restive slaves that I had to deal with. And so I can imagine motivations for record keeping in either direction. It doesn't make the ship log any more trustworthy. I think we have to take these ship logs with a serious grain of salt. And I wish I could squeeze more juice out of the one that I have. But yeah, these are problematic sources. Trey, hey.
Hi. It seems like the kingdom that you focused on was closer to the coast, and it seemed like they had a pretty good relationship with the European kingdom that they were working with. Was this kind of exclusive to African kingdoms that were on the coast, or were there more empires or kingdoms that were more inland that they also had similar type of relationships?
The Europeans hung out at the coast, and partly because it was convenient for them to stay at the coast, but partly because inland political authorities didn't want them coming in further than the coast either. So it suited both sides of the relationship. Europeans purchased captives who themselves might have traveled hundreds of miles from inland, but the Europeans almost never went very far. Certainly, let me go back to my map. So on this part of the coast, Europeans, almost never went even as far north as Abomey, which, like today, you could drive from the coast to Abomey in 2 hours, I guess. And they never went further north than that.
I like to mention how a lot of the revolts are often on ships that were mostly women. What do you think the motivations were? Like, I would understand like how horrific those conditions were, but like what do you think really made those specific ships like revolt the way they did? Because as you said, like women were supposed to be the ones that didn't revolt as much, right?
That's the question I want to write a book to try to answer. But my theory is this sort of large-scale structural change that I was trying to outline with my wave metaphor, that a century into slaving in this region, there had been such concentration of wealth and sort of gender oppression on the part of elites, frankly, that there came to be a tipping point where women had just had enough. That's my theory. But if people have a better hypothesis, help me, please. William.
I'm going to ask a question.
Okay.
Well, perhaps this is. So I was wondering exactly how many of the captains actually made it, and how many perished during the voyage. And then also, could you talk about women's role in religion in that society? Well, are there actually just two genders? First of all, but then you talk about women's role in religion in that society. Like, for example, the God that you mentioned, is the God gendered in some way? And then also, like, what is women's role in religious ceremonies?
Are there only two genders? Historians fight about that. So are you familiar with Ronke Oyewumi's book, The Invention of Women, which is about Yoruba women, so it's slightly further to the east than here, but similar cultural area. And her argument is that two genders was something that came with colonialism, and that pre-colonial Yoruba gender notions were much broader, either broader or less broad. There's either more than two genders or there's no gender at all. It's unclear what argument she's making, but the two is imposed from outside. Other Yoruba historians say, no, I'm not quite buying that argument. So it's something that people are arguing about. But, so I don't know, is the question. But certainly by the time Europeans were there writing things down, and that's where our written sources from this place start, essentially, in the 18th century. By that time, there had been a whole lot of slaving already going on. So if there were social changes that came with the slave trade, we don't have written sources that tell us what things were like before. But those sources talk about very much of a two-gender division of society, division of labor. But there were female devotees of Sakpata. There were female priests of Sakpata. Sakpata, in the sources that I have access to, which were written later, Sakpata is described as him. Doesn't necessarily mean in the 18th century people thought Sakpata was a him. But there were certainly female devotees. This is revealing how much more work I need to do on the questions that you're asking about. But what else? What was the other piece of your question?
What were the numbers of people that perished?
Oh, I'd have to look it up, but I think out of an initial 427, something like 25 died.
So that's a really low number, right?
But by the 18th century, that was about average. The earlier period of time was more, had higher percentages. Yeah, but it's a low percentage even considering that they had this smallpox epidemic. Florence. Hi.
I really enjoyed your talk, Lisa. Thank you. First question might be sort of obvious. I don't know, but you commented on some of the reasons why this larger number of women may have been sent away as unruly women and so forth. As far as the reasons why they might also have been desirable as slaves, was it also perceived that they were reproducers as well as laborers? Was that might be the obvious part, I don't know, but I just wanted to do a comment on that. And also, are there specific insights, would you say, from feminist historians that have given you different angles on these kinds of questions, and maybe on the question of genders and how many genders, but more broadly?
Sorry, it's been such a long day. What's the first part of your question again?
If women were desirable.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and you're probably lobbing me a softball. Maybe you know the answer to this question. But the standard historiography is that European purchasers preferred men and African enslavers preferred to keep women, which worked out very well. So when people were enslaved in Africa, women would be channeled into circuits of circulation that stayed in Africa as slaves in Africa, and men would be put into more likely into Atlantic-facing channels of circulation because of these different preferences. And African purchasers preferred female slaves because they both produced and reproduced. Europeans preferred male slaves because they worked them harder right from the beginning, and there wasn't enough. The reproduction wasn't really part of the equation until much later. So yes, that was part of it. But I'm sorry, now I've lost my...
The other part. Yeah. But are there any specific insights from feminists?
Oh, yes. Well, the one work that I'm drawing on a lot is this book by Edna Bay called Wives of the Leopard, which is about the women in the Dahomey Palace. And she reconstructed it based on oral traditions of descendants in Dahomey who there's an oral tradition of this, but it hadn't shown up in European sources. And so it's really from that set of insights that allowed us then to go back and look at the written sources and read them sideways and find instances where it confirms these kinds of gender arrangements in the palaces, but they didn't really jump out at us until we knew what to look for. Joseph?
Yeah, I want to go back to Vicky's question and ask a little bit more about the methodology that's used to talk about the numbers of rebellions that took place, and even in this particular case. So we see someone who says that somebody jumped overboard. For some people, that is a rebellious, that is the act that really regains agency for the individual. The fact that you now have taken your life is yours, and you did what you wanted to do with it. And there are others who were just, somebody jumped overboard. Do you see in what you've been doing that the methodology has been probably that dominant in determining how people count and do the percentages of what happened? There's some people who say, well, you know, if somebody refuses to eat, for example,
that's a rebellion?
Exactly, that is part of the rebellion, that I am thwarting whatever it is you're trying to do with me. I'm not allowing you to do it. So how is that factoring into what you plan to do?
That's a good question, and I almost should punt it to my student Nancy, who's like not looking. Because Nancy's working on suicide in the Middle Passage. You know, the rates of insurrection that historians work with have all been compiled in that online slave trade database, slavevoyages.org, and they have pretty strict definitions of what counts as rebellion. And so, right, refusing to eat wouldn't count in their tally, which makes me think that their tally is the bottom of the estimate, right? That it's a conservative guess. I don't know, Nancy, do you want to say any more about it?
Sorry, but do you have a question?
No, I'm just trying to subvert the dominant paradigm, which is an old thing we used to talk about. But the idea, yeah, you can tell the old people in the audience. But anyway, this idea that rebellion can only be counted in terms of people who rise up with arms and that kind of thing, that poisoning the crew, for example, is rebellion. I looked at your sort of travelogue there, and I looked at the place where the person jumped overboard, and it's in the middle of the ocean. I mean, it's not like it's near a port where you might be able to swim back. So as an act of resistance, if you will, are they being counted? And that's why I don't pay much. I do pay attention, but I don't give much shrift to these online catalogs that sort of exclude those actions. So suicide, as a matter of fact.
Well, I think that most enslaved people on the ships knew they were very important and knew their importance to ship captains and the whole slave trade. So I feel that personally, I think that yes, even suicides were definitely rebellions, trying to, I don't always want to say agency, but it was an agency for these people. So we should count suicides as rebellion. We should count refusing sustenance, food as rebellion. We should count, jumping overboard as a form of rebellion because it did fight against the institution of slavery. So unfortunately, yes, we look at rebellions as taking just arms, and fight and use the whole physical, but sometimes just the little actions that they do, Vincent Brown says we should just follow their actions. We don't have to conclude, we just need to follow them. They won't follow them, we know how and when, that's what they wanted to do. Unfortunately, we can't really read the minds of the slave people today, but then through their actions, I think how they want to do it too. And I just follow up, I had a question, just a little bit.
Before you ask your question, can I follow up with mine?
All right, we'll come back to you.
The spiritual, because they're also, in some instances, not necessarily a spiritual, but there is an element of a notion of afterlife in the sea that factors in. So it's not simply that you think you're killing yourself, it's that you're going, and there have been a number of new plays, even in terms of science fiction and Afrofuturist plays that talk about those individuals who dived in and started a new life beneath the waves. So I'm trying to. You're gonna have a heck of a book by the time. So I want to yield to you. I know you said you had a question as well.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, I was just a little bit curious. Whether you found other ships that sailed from the Bight of Benin to the New World, because often with this trade, ship captains are often warned that be careful, don't buy cargo from this particular part of the coast because they are warring. For instance, the Comanches, they are very warring, and sometimes they warn that they commit a lot of suicide. So I don't know whether you've seen maybe examples of some ships like that, or maybe some form of warning to these people that hey, don't go there, and how would it.
Well, it's more that in this particular historical moment, so in a period of a couple of years, the numbers of ships docking there had fallen off. And slave traders said, oh, it's because not enough people are for sale at the port of Ouida. And what they said amongst themselves was, oh, the king of Dahomey, the king of Dahomey has become weak. He's not sending his army out to, where do we go? He's not sending his army to the north enough and taking in enough captives. This shows a sign, this is a sign of his weakness. And so in response, the king got wind of this, and he sent a letter to the British fort at Ouida and said, send the word out that I'm going to go out and get plenty of captives. You better bring slave ships. I will have captives ready for them. And what I think may have happened, but then we don't have any evidence that the Dahomey army actually did go on campaign after that. But that's when Norris showed up, and then these captives were provided by the palace. So that's another reason why I think the monarchy is like turning in on itself to generate captives. In an earlier period of time, the army would go out every year and on these what they called hunting expeditions and go out and take captives and sell them at the coast. But for one reason or other, by the late 1760s, 1770s, that was happening less and less, and both the European ship captains and the monarchy, the Dahomey monarchy, both commented on it.
Yeah. Sorry. Well, in my readings, you've read all what I'm right, so bad. But then I've been thinking, just looking at the dynamic of the African cosmology and the West African cosmology, got me thinking, because other ships also had those particular the smallpox, dysentery, and all that.
Yeah.
And ship captains and ship surgeons always said it was maybe melancholy or maybe dysentery and all those other bad conditions. But what made the unity so unique that they felt it was African cosmology, it was from Zapata, it was spiritual?
So why do I think it's Sakbata? Or do I think it's unique?
Yeah, like what makes it so unique? Because I would feel that as a ship captain, I would interpret it as maybe just the conditions that are happening on other ships too, but to be able to connect it to spiritual.
Oh, Norris didn't connect it to Sakbata. He has no idea. This is my interpretation. But I think the other ships from the Bight of Benin at this time may have all been experiencing the same thing. Because you're right, they all had smallpox on them. And the people in those slave ships all knew about Sakbata. It may be that the other slave ships didn't do what Norris did, which was the forced inoculation, and that may have just ratcheted up the level of intensity of things. But I'm not sure that the unity was unusual. I think it might have been part of a cohort effect, but we just happen to have the ship log for the unity. We don't have the ship log for the other ones.
Well, I should just add that today, Benin is known for a place in Africa that honors a lot of spirituality. So if you want to learn more about African spirituality, its connection to cosmology and all that, you should definitely go to Benin.
Yeah.
I was wondering a couple of things. So firstly, I'm interested in knowing more about like the experience of children that were on board the ship, because I know you talked a lot about the experience of like men and women, and specifically I was wondering like the percentage of children, if that's anywhere in the logs that were on the ship, and if you believe that the number of children on any particular slave ship impacted in any way whether that group of people on that ship were more or less likely to engage in rebellion.
That is a question that I know somebody has answered, but I don't know what the answer is. But somebody who's done all of the data manipulation or statistical manipulation with the slave trade database, they can answer that question. I don't know what the answer is.
It's in the exhibition.
Oh, so what's the answer?
It's in the exhibition. And the large book where we made the panels from has that information. So if you go in, you'll see the large book. But there are huge panels on the wall with the percentages of children, adults, and women and children, women and men as well.
And do you know if that impacted in any way, like whether groups of people were likely to engage in experiments?
Well, these are the experts, but I will say that in one instance, it was reported that because children were allowed to run free, in many cases unchained, that in some instances, it wasn't the Amistad, was it? Where
There were a lot of children on the Amistad.
that they were the ones that slipped the tools to the men that allowed them to break their chains and start that rebellion. I wouldn't argue that was, something that was very widespread, but I'm not sure, again, if anybody has done that specific study, if it was more likely that they would rise up in those circumstances. I would suspect that anybody, regardless of who's there, would probably do so.
On this ship, I don't know what proportion were children. I know there were some children. Norris just wrote male, female. But occasionally in his law, well, when he recorded deaths, every now and then he would say girl or boy rather than man or woman. And in fact, the thing that started the first rebellion is when the girl with lockjaw died. And that was the trigger for the first rebellion.
Thanks, Bob. I mean, question for you so much more.
Sorry, we'll come back to you, Rita.
I wonder to what extent the database from the Liverpool Museum is comparable to or more broadly based than the Atlantic slave trade progress at Emory and part of the consortium who helped to run it.
Well, the International Slavery Museum website where I got the digitized log is not a comprehensive database like that one at Emory. And that one is very statistical, whereas the Liverpool Slavery Museum is largely a presentation of artifacts. Okay, thanks. Ureta, you had a question.
Yes, I was just curious as to, you mentioned earlier the whole discussion they had between white and one enslaved woman and the other based on her age. I was just curious, like, what kind of distinctions were made between girl and woman, and how did that differ between the African society and how they became associated?
Sometimes the ship captains, the merchants' instructions to ship captains will delineate, and they say, you know, because they're basically purchasing orders, and they're saying, we want you to buy 2/3 men and 1/3 women, and no more than X percentage of children. And sometimes they say you can tell somebody is a child, or somebody is defined as a child if they are shorter than, and it'll give like a height requirement. But they don't know. They can't tell people's ages. And it's all very rough. And of course, they want to classify as many people as possible in the category that is the most profitable for them, which is sort of people in their young adulthood. And so it's another one of these things. You just have to take the records with a serious grain of salt. And also the records are really sparse.
There have been other factors such as the level, the skill level of regions, or slaves in regions where maybe rice wasn't produced or income was produced. We know from things like handbills and that sort of thing that there was recruitment on some of these regions, specifically for enslaved people that might be going to slave South Carolina, or low country in the South.
You're talking about the black rice cases?
Yeah. And then there was another part to this that I wanted to raise about various forms of cultural agency that were informed or supported the system. Spiritual practice, for instance, such as working, or there was no mention of enslaved people who were Muslims.
Sure.
Black West. So it's sort of a two-part question, but you know, if we look at the time frame of all this, 18th century, we see the numbers increasing in relationship to what's going on in Haiti at the time, sugar production, and specifically in parts of Jamaica and in Brazil, for that matter. That might account for lower numbers dying in the crossing, or certainly there are a number of issues that
Well, and the majority, in fact, of enslaved people from the port of Ouida in this period were going to Haiti, which is why we think of Haitian Vodun coming straight out of the Dahomey pantheon, or this region's religious pantheon. It wasn't an area with very many Muslims in this period, so although there were enslaved Muslims who were trafficked across the Atlantic, not so much from this particular area. Yeah. But I think, you know, you and I are both sort of skirting around the same topic that's hard to pin down, which is the spiritual or psychological or cosmological things that people brought with them that propelled survival and resistance, or that motivated survival and resistance. And I'm trying to get at that with Zapata. But as you've no doubt been able to tell, the sources are really slippery and vague. And this may just be the tip of the iceberg, that there's all sorts of spiritual understandings and cultural practices and psychological understandings that people took with them, that equipped them to try to survive, to try to resist, and we just don't have good tools for getting to that.
So I used the moment to bring something up that was been going around in my head. I've been listening to this breathlessly. I've been teaching for many years on a slim book by a Caribbean writer from Martinique, Chamboiseau, and it's translated as Creole folk tales. And so these are children's fairy tales, and one of the stories that my students love is called The Woman Who Bled Hearts Dry. and it has every element you've been talking about. And this is come from the oral tradition, from enslaved people in Martinique, and from the 18th century, and it discusses an uprising in a slave ship. And it seems that this is a common occurrence, the way and it's led by a little old hag. That's how she's presented. So it's a tiny old woman, enslaved person who is leading the uprising, and she does it in many ways, including encouraging people to jump overboard, including sort of drawing people's hearts, whatever that means. It's a spiritual and a material and medical issue. And so it has everything you've been discussing for the last hour or so.
I'm going to have to track down this source, but thank you.
And I'm just thinking that this is where literature and arts can help us understand what might be going on there. So thank you very much. I'm really happy I'm listening to this.
Thank you. I'm very happy to have heard that.
So these are stories that were written by Chamoiseau in the 80s. And it's the first attempt really in the Francophone world from the Caribbean to come to terms with the repercussions of French colonialism. And it's a very unusual way to enter this really torturous history by way of playful presentation, but very serious. So, thank you very much.
So, for the unity, is it really unique for the cell to be inoculated, or is it something that they learn as they progress to make sure that people can actually progress through the journey itself?
That's what I'm trying to figure out. I've been looking at medical information. Steve may have found something in the French archives from the 18th century about French versions of this. But Europeans and Africans both are reported to have done this kind of inoculation in the 1770s. And it's where you take some pus from a sore and inject it into someone else. So I don't know. And the ship log, captain's log, uses the passive construction. The slaves were inoculated, so we don't even know who did it. That is one of the areas I'm going to try to dig deeper into, but at this point, I don't know. So if people have suggestions, other than that French archival document, please let me. Right, and this was before Edward Jenner. This is before vaccination per se, but people were doing this as sort of a initial step. Steve.
I'll follow the tradition and take being mentioned as an excuse to ask a question. So I, perhaps unsurprisingly, was also really struck and kind of excited by your phrasing of this as kind of West African Age of Revolution. Because generally when I think of West Africa within the Age of Revolution, it's more tied to the jihadist, like caliphate movement a little later than this, right? That the Islamic revolutions, I'm now going to forget the historian who wrote that book. Someone has called it that, like tying this into, the Age of Revolution, and I'm really interested in that moment from the 1760s on that really sees this whole system that, the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in general is so integral to, this whole Atlantic system upturned in all of these different ways. And I guess what I was curious of, and I imagine some of the answer to this is there are limited sources on it, do you tie this, is there more unrest among the king's wives in Dahomey? Is this a period in the 1760s and 70s as they start, I have also read some of your sources on this from the French ones. I know this is a moment where they're more prone to sell these women into slavery, and the French seem to think this is a weird thing that's happening, that he's willing to sell his wives. Is that causing more unrest? Is this maybe tied into that broader kind of, popular frustration in the 1760s, 70s, 80s that is?
Maybe. But here's one thing. I mean, you and I have talked about this. The sources in this broad couple decade period, all of a sudden are full of the word adultery. And Europeans love, in English, well, and the French ones too, they love talking about how Africans sold women for adultery. Oh, these women were enslaved for adultery. And it makes it seem like it's their own damn fault that they've been enslaved, right? If only they weren't sleeping around or something. But I think two things are going on. One, I think slave traders like to talk about African women that way because it satisfies their prurient stereotypes. But the second thing that I think is going on is that in this period of concentration of wealth and elite polygamy, women who were part of large polygynous concentrations and who had relationships outside of that, as one would be likely to do, frankly, were being punished. And they're being sold off as punishment. And then Europeans get to say, oh, well, they're being punished for adultery. It's okay that we are enslaving them. And so this is, at the risk of sounding a little too pedantic, this is African patriarchy and European patriarchy meeting each other and in symbiotic ways. That it was beneficial to both of them to do this, but by calling it adultery, they're turning it into a domestic sexual matter rather than a matter of women resisting and being part of perhaps an age of revolution, but women resisting the concentration of wealth that was happening because of the slave trade. Boom, boom, boom. Yeah. All right, thank you, everybody.
You all don't know how much she resisted doing this. She did not want to do this presentation. She wanted us to bring in other people, but you understand now why we wanted her here. Sometimes the best folk are right here in your house. So let's give her a hand once again. And extract the promise that she'll do her first book talk right here when she finishes. Thank you all for coming out. For those who want to see that book where you can get the data and whatever, I'll show it to you back over here. And you also have more books of Dr. Lindsay back here for sale as well if you'd like to get one. Thank you again for coming out.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
You did it.